Five Sports Podcast, the spot, season number 5, episode number 15. And yeah, we up in here, man. First and foremost, man, I hope you guys had a great weekend as we jump off into the sport landscape this week at the top of the week. And if it's your first time listening, we on Five Sports Podcast, the spot. We provide hot fire takes and analysis across the sporting landscape. And if you're OG of the show, I appreciate the check-in once again as we mosey on along, man. Fresh in the month of November. Yeah, we getting down to the end of the year. Things about to get cold across the country. A lot of us, doing out the hustle and bustle. Probably going to be a little bit more indoors during this time of the year. Kicking it with family and friends and so forth. So now we got you, man. Appreciate you guys checking in, man. We got a lot to cover, man, on this episode, man. We just concluded week number 9 across the National Football League. It was some epic, ups and downs. The Bengals, blowing, the game again. The Bears almost blew the game and won it back. There was a lot jumping off. We had, Kansas City and Buffalo locking horns. As the Buffalo Bills was able to handle that business at home as well, say this week. We definitely going to get across the whole slate in week number 9. Also, we got the trade deadline jumping off. And, it was a moves by the New York Jets. It was obvious that the Jets at this point were sellers. This team is going nowhere fast. They unloaded Quentin Williams, defensive tackle. This guy's a 3-time Pro Bowler, man. I was high on this guy when he came into the National Football League from USC. And, they shipped him off to the Dallas Cowboys, man, for some picks. Just in that situation, also, too, we had young Sauce, man. That Saucy era is done up in New York. They trade Sauce Gardner to the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts, fresh off a loss this weekend to the Pittsburgh Steelers. They just trying to fortify their fort. And so, these moves, as I mentioned, the Jets have really been sellers. They ain't going nowhere, man. So it's best for them to just kind of load up and see what they do. For the Cowboys, man, they may be a day late and a dollar short. I think Williams is a good, addition. Him and, Kenny Clark, they was able to get, via that Michael Parsons trade. They laid a dollar short, though, man. This team ain't going nowhere. Talking about the Dallas Cowboys, fresh off an L against the Arizona Cardinals on Monday Night Football last night. Cardinals was able to win that football game 27-17. Jacoby Brissett out there looking real good, man. Shout out to Marvin Harrison Jr. He had a nice little night with a touchdown in that game. And, he's getting the ball out and Brissett playing smart football. And, I think that, and there's breaking news earlier today is that they're going to go ahead and start Brissett. He's going to be the guy, at least for the next week to see what he do. The Cardinals still got a shot at, getting maybe on the low end of the NFC playoff race or playoff hunt. And so it's their best move to make. I'm 100% behind this move. I think that Kyler Murray, this guy's been inconsistent. They paying him a big bag of money, but at the end of the day, these coaches' jobs is lined up whether or not this Arizona Cardinal team can at least have a fighting chance of getting into the playoffs, and I think that lies with Jacoby Brissett. We saw it last night, even though the Dallas Cowboys probably got the worst defense in the National Football League, them and the Cincinnati Bengals. It still was a nice little game and building confidence on that offensive side of the ball. This team, Arizona, has lost a lot of close games, and so, they was able to get that victory last night, man, down there in Jerry's World, and for the Cowboys, a bad loss. The NFC ain't getting no better. Getting no worse. So, they got to, tighten up them bootstraps, man. So we'll see what they do moving forward. Also, man, it's my first time I've checked in with you guys since we've had the conclusion of the World Series, man. Congratulations, first and foremost, to the Los Angeles Dodgers. Two-time defending, now repeat World Series champions. We haven't seen this, man, since the early 2000s, man, with the New York Yankees 25 years ago. Just a stellar franchise. It's a team that was the best team baseball money could buy. It was a team that a lot of people thought going into the season was easily going to win 100-plus ball games this year. They fell a little short of that, but when it was time to play some baseball, in the playoffs and you get into the nitty-gritty, they was about that life. And, shout out as well, man, to the Toronto Blue Jays. It was an epic Game 7. One of the best Game 7s I've seen in a while, man. Just up there. A lot of people say it was the greatest Game 7 ever. It's kind of hard to say, man. You got 1991 Game 7 Braves and Minnesota Twins. To me, arguably probably the best Game 7. Can't forget about my Chicago Cubs a couple years back, knocking off the then Cleveland Indians. able to win a World Series championship in a rain out extra inning game 7. So, we've seen some epic game 7s, man, in the World Series. But, the Dodgers, the latest up the crack, man, with an epic, classic, finish, big home run, man, and, in the bottom of the ninth inning. Toronto was 2 outs away from winning the world championship. Would have been their first world championship since the Joe Carter days in the early 90s. This team, Cito Gaston, the manager at that time, had won 2 championships back then. But, to the victor goes the spoils, man. So congratulations to the Los Angeles Dodgers once again. Clayton Kershaw, his final game as MLB pitcher, man. He's definitely going to get into the Hall of Fame without question. It's good to see him celebrate with his guys, man. One final ride, man, for him. So, the baseball, putting a bow on that. Again, congratulations to the Los Angeles Dodgers. Another World Series championship for them. Say into the fold. Also, pivoting to the NBA, we're going to talk some NBA. Most latest news coming from the NBA, this whole situation with Ja Morant and the Memphis Grizzlies. These two entities, I'm not sure if they're at a crossroads. There's been a lot of heat out there about, whether or not it's time for the Memphis Grizzlies to move on from Ja Morant. And it's obviously he's not feeling the coach. And so we had a situation now to where coach just got there. They just fired Taylor Jenkins. And I'm not sure if Morant was either in on the firing of Taylor Jenkins. I'm not sure if Morant was, pissed off about the firing of Taylor Jenkins. I'm one to go with the latter just based on like his attitude and his swag, even though he had his issues off the court. He never really was this dismissive, when Taylor Jenkins was the coach, even though there was a lot going on at that particular time. And so I don't think that he's feeling their system. He's a guy with his, hands on the ball. He's the orchestrator. So if the orchestrator guy is not happy with the offense that's being ran, your team really ain't going to go nowhere. You may win some games here and there, but at the end of the day, that's going to come out to the light. And so, they're at the crossroads. He got suspended for a game. It's the organization trying to stand up to him a little bit on that. But we all know, man, with, superstar kind of players or well-notable players, if they want to get out of a situation, they're going to get out of a situation. I think that those two parties, if it comes to that point, they're going to have to be able to work something out. Try to figure that whole terrain out, man, in that situation. And so it's going to be interesting to see what that thing do moving forward. Also, man, shout out to Giannis. Last night, big time, bucket against the Indiana Pacers for game. Doing it again as he always do. Just in that series, it's been a rocky road between those two teams. But, Milwaukee probably got the upper hand right now with Tyrese Halliburton being out in the fold. And so, last night, just showed just how gritty and tough that Indiana is playing. Rick Carlisle, he's to me, one of the upper tier coaches in the NBA. Former world champion, got his team, really a half away from winning an NBA championship last season. And so, this team is going to fight, man. But, I just think that for the Milwaukee Bucks, they could be a team that could be sneaky in the East. The Knicks, they've been kind of 50-50 so far. There's been a lot of other, teams that, the Atlanta Hawks, if you ask Vegas, they had the Hawks finishing at a better record in the Eastern Conference than the Milwaukee Bucks at the beginning of the season. And so, they got, speaking of the Atlanta Hawks, Trae Young's going to be out for at least about a month, so Hawks got to figure that out, man. This is a franchise that, Trae Young is kind of the centerpiece of this organization, but they got, some good young players, man, but they got to be able to kind of figure it out and get an identity with Quinn Snyder. We'll see what the Hawks do moving forward, man, with Trae Young being out into the fold. So, there's a lot of, stuff cracking off, man, across, the whole sporting landscape. And as I mentioned, we just had the, trade deadline that is, finalized. That's over and done with. I think that for the most part, hadn't been a lot of sellers. Like I said, the Jets, they was in a situation, they ain't really had no other choice but to sell. I was really surprised that the New Orleans Saints, a team that's going nowhere as well, that they didn't sell as well. They got some pieces that a lot of teams, figure it's kind of valuable out there. But the Saints, or as they used to say back in the day, the Aints, man, it's going to be a long season for them as well as the Jets. But enough of all that, man. We're going to get into week number 9 as a whole. Just break down the games that, caught my eye through week number 9. Break everything down across the National Football League. We also, too, going to put a bow on this episode at the end, man. I got my Big Five power rankings across the National Football League through week number 9 of the season. So, man, once again, man, I appreciate you guys. Don't forget to check us out on YouTube. We on Fire Sports. On X as well as Twitter at We On Fire Sports. So we out here, man. Appreciate it. Listen to the podcast also too. on basically where all podcasting be listened to, not only Podbean also. So, man, appreciate it, man. Coming up, got the rest of the show. We on 5 Sports Podcast. The Spot. Yeah, we're going to get right into it. Week number 9 across the National Football League. We're now halfway through the NFL season now, and things are unfolding a little bit. We still got it kind of wide open just as a whole on the NFC as well as the AFC side. There's a lot of football left to be played. There's a lot of teams that still trying to jockey for position as far as being legitimate. There's some teams that are struggling right now that might rise up and become legitimate through these next 7 or 8 weeks during the NFL season. But, for me, it's an interesting slate we had across week number 9 across the NFL. And things jumped off on Thursday. We had the Baltimore Ravens and Lamar Jackson coming back into the fold. He basically missed a month, out due to injury. Taking on the hapless Miami Dolphins. The Ravens was able to win this football game 28-6. Lamar Jackson looked like he had never left. 4 touchdown passes, getting his tight ends into the fold. And this Ravens team, especially defensively, holding the Dolphins to 6 points. We all know the Dolphins are a walking dead football club. They let go Chris Greer, the GM of the Miami Dolphins. A lot of us who follow the Dolphins, we do, especially if you're OG of the show. It's a situation where I seen that coming. We got Mike McDaniel. He's probably going to be fired most likely at the end of the season. And so this team is going to have to get on rebuild mode. Probably going to get a high draft pick in the NFL draft. Might move on from quarterback off tour. They owe them still a big bag of money. And so this Miami thing, man, has just turned into a nightmare, hence, the holiday, well, not holiday, but a Halloween weekend. And so, man, for the Ravens, they improved to 3-5 on the season. They still kind of the favorites to win that division, that AFC North. I don't really know about it right now, especially after Pittsburgh having a nice little win coming up this weekend. We'll get into that in a little bit. But, it's a big-time win for the Ravens. It's 2 games in a row for them. So we'll see what they do moving forward for the Dolphins. As we all know, man, it's straight been one for them. So, they're going to get ready to tear it down. Obviously making trades as well, trading their pass rusher to the Philadelphia Eagles, man. And so, we'll see what that thing do for the rest of the season if the Dolphins have a fire sale or not, man. So we'll definitely check into that if there's anything that breaks down there in South Florida. Then we transition, man, to the game, man, that, had to sit back and watch. I had my popcorn ready like T.O., man, my Chicago Bears traveling up to Cincinnati to take on the Cincinnati Bengals. There's a lot going on across week number 9, but, I had to pause for the calls, of course, man, to check out my Bears. It's a team that last week we lost to the Baltimore Ravens, a game that we should have easily won, especially without Lamar Jackson, but that's a story for another day. The Bengals, this is a team, Joe Flacco into the fold until Joe Burrow comes back. It's a team that's trying to hold on for dear life, especially in the AFC North. It hadn't been any breakout teams, so they still theoretically got a shot. But this game was crazy, man. The Bears came out offensively looking real well. I knew they was going to come out kind of early in the game, being able to get their footing. They tweaked out the first part of the game by, letting the first play of the game be a kickoff for a touchdown, man. But, I think the Bears was able to settle down, got their footing. Then we got into, the third and fourth quarter of this football game, and the Cincinnati Bengals, and I said it on last week's show that this team was going to try to rally, especially playing at home. The Bears just had to hold firm, and the Bears almost just straight gave up the football game. T. Higgins, having 2 touchdowns in this game, 121 yards. He was amazing. Jamar Chase had a bill as well out there. Bears was able to run the football, man. Kyle Monangai, man, 176 yards, man. What an outstanding day by this guy. Looks like, it might be a running back controversy up in Chicago with Swift being out in this football game. Bears was able to hold on, a big-time touchdown from Caleb Williams to Coastal Loveland. Right at the end of this football game, Bears able to win this one 47-42. Huge win for the Bears based on the fact that, the Packers lost, as well as, we had the Lions lose as well. So, big time, victory for my Chicago Bears. We improved to 5-3 on the season. For the Bengals, a game that, again, let it slip. This is a team that's notorious for putting up 35 and 40 pieces and still losing. It was like that last season. Can't blame that on Joe Burrow, man. His defense is hot garbage. And so for my Bears, we moving on to greener pastures, man, next week. For the Bengals, man, they got to pick up the pieces on this one. Then we transition, as I mentioned, the Lions lost. The Vikings taking on the Lions, man, traveling up in Detroit to knock off the Detroit Lions 27-24. We had McCarthy coming back into the fold. J.J. McCarthy, finally, getting off the injury snide, coming in. I believe he had 3 touchdowns in this game, man. Just came back outstanding. The Lions, they just didn't look the same. Goff, he had a couple TDs in this game, close to, 300 yards. But, Sam Laporta had a good game. But Gibbs, he was non-existent. The Vikings was able to shut down the run. Flores was able to shut down the run. I thought that the Lions coming into this game, I had a win in this game, man. But the Vikings, they improved to 4-4 on the season. The Lions, they dropped to 5-3 on the year. It's good news for my Bears. I ain't going to front, but we'll see what the Lions do moving forward. This is a team that, ever since they kind of got on that winning streak, I think they had won a stint of 4 games in a row after losing the first one. They really hadn't been the same kind of team, man. So I'm not sure if it's the remnants of having the coordinators be gone, but that new car smell kind of gone off the Detroit Lions, man. We'll see what they do moving forward. We spoke about Green Bay, man, the Packers, man, at home against the Carolina Panthers. This is a game that most of us in America thought that the Packers would be able to handle that business, fresh off a nice little win against the Pittsburgh Steelers last week. But this is why the games is played. And, the Panthers able to win this game 16-13. Field goal at the end of the game, man. Shout out to Rico Dowdle, man. 130 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns. He's definitely down to start running back for the Carolina Panthers at this point. Jordan Love on the other side of the coin, no touchdowns and had an interception, just didn't play well. And, I've been saying this, man. If you follow the podcast, man, and a fan of the show, I got mixed feelings about Jordan Love because I think, he's a good talent, but I don't think he's an elite talent. And I think that really to get to where you need to go, quarterback got to be at an elite type of level, man, to get, the Green Bay Packers to the Super Bowl once again. So we'll see what they do, man. Another, bad loss for the Packers. They 5-2-1 on the year. For the Panthers, they 5-4. Dave Canales, this team, they winning ugly. But as a young team, you'll take these type of games, man. So shout out, man, to the Panthers winning this one once again, 16-13. Then we go down the slate, man, and it's funny, you think on paper the 1 o'clock window games wouldn't be exciting, but, there was some good couple of little games sprinkled in there, man. And, another game I was sprinkled in there, New England Patriots, man, taking on the Atlanta Falcons. Patriots was able to win this game 24-23. Drake made 2 touchdowns on the day for him. Shout out to Drake London, man, for the Atlanta Falcons, man. 3 touchdowns, man. Great one-handed touchdown in the back of the end zone on one of those plays, man. And it's just, he was just looking as an elite wide receiver in this league. But the Falcons, man, and Raheem Morris, man, this team just does not have an identity. Now, they got some good talent on the football squad, especially with Pierce Jr., on the defensive side of the coin, just making good draft picks, and they've gotten better athletically on the defensive side of the ball. But this team still does not have an identity. And, Falcons, playing in that, NFC South, it's a division that, a lot of people feel like, they had an outside chance to try to win that division this season. But they've gone off to a bad start, man. 3-5 on the year. The Pats improved to 7-2 on the season. And this is a team, Mike Vrabel, I believe it's 5 in a row for the Patriots, man. This man got this team rolling. Former Patriot, former Super Bowl champion. Teammate of, Tom Brady, Bill Belichick up there in the fold. Shout out to Robert Kraft. And this team has turned the page. You got to think about it, man. Less than a year ago, you had, Mayo, who's the head coach, former player as well, Gerard Mayo. That didn't work out. They pivoted to Mike Vrabel, a guy that, had, experience with his coaching stint up in Tennessee. I thought that Tennessee made a mistake in firing Mike Vrabel, and we see what he do, man. So shout out to the Patriots, man. 7-2 on the year, man, in that AFC East. A lot of people thought it was Buffalo division to win, but Patriots got something to say about that. So we'll see when those two teams, lock horns a little bit later on in the slate. So can't wait for that one. Then we had, another battle in the AFC. The Indianapolis Colts traveling to Pittsburgh to take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Colts was talk of the National Football League coming into this game 7-1 on the year. The Steelers, this was a team that was reeling after last week loss to the Green Bay Packers. Just didn't know what it was, but once again, Mike Tomlin, he's a guy that always bounced back like Big Sean. You know what I'm saying? Like, at the end of the day, you got a winning record. He's always going to maintain a winning record. They may not do nothing in the playoffs, but this season might be a little bit different. I just think that, for them defensively, they stepped up, stopped Jonathan Taylor, held them to under 50 yards on the ground. That's a feat in itself. Daniel Jones was turned back over into a turnover machine once again. And so I'm loving what I'm seeing from the Steelers defense. Like I said, Tomlin got the pulse of this football club. This was a game that I previewed going in. I thought the Steelers would be able to knock off the Colts. I think the Steelers was just a little bit more desperate. And sometimes when you're a young team and you're 7-1 and you're the talk of the National Football League, you got to travel on the road within the conference. And sometimes you get clipped. And that's exactly what happened to the Indianapolis Colts. The Steelers were able to win this one 27-20. Then we had a grudge match game in the AFC, man. There's a lot of good AFC matchups this week, man. We had the Denver Broncos traveling down to Houston to take on the Houston Texans. Texans, they've been an enigma all year, just up and down all season long. CJ Stroud, been running for his life, and he ran for his life, this Sunday, and, ended up getting knocked out the football game. He may be okay. We got to see and check in with that situation with him. The Broncos, man, once again, winning ugly. It's a big-time win for Bo Nix. Had 2 touchdowns in this football game. They weren't able to, run the ball like they wanted to in this football game. The Texans obviously got a stout defense, so they turned into, what we call, gangster matters, man. Was able to pull this ugly win out, was able to win the football game. And so, I just think that at the end of the day, the Broncos, they improved to 7-2 on the year, and I just like what I see from Sean Payton. And, I just think that, for them just to be on top of it, as far as just what that AFC has to offer right now, I'm loving what I'm seeing. You're a fan of the show. I was critical of Sean Payton, but, he's making it do what it do, man, out there in Denver, man. Then, another game before we get into what we call the heavyweight battle is the New Orleans Saints took on the Los Angeles Rams. We're going to keep it short and sweet on this one, man. Matt Stafford outstanding. 4 touchdowns in this football game. The Saints, they dropped to 1-8. This is probably the worst team in the National Football League right now. It's just, old school, brown paper bag over their heads, man, in the Superdome, man, down there in New Orleans, man. And it's just going to be a long year for them. Tyler Shuck, the rookie quarterback, I got mixed feelings about him. We just don't know. For the Rams, the offense was clicking on all cylinders. Puka Nacua got a little banged up in this game, but according to Sean McVay, thinks everything's probably going to be straight with him. Kyron Williams, 100 yards on the ground, touchdown this football game as well. And so, Devontae Adams, had a touchdown, I believe, also in this football game as well. So, I'm liking what I'm seeing, man, from the Rams. They're a team now that improved to 6-2 on the year. Sean McVay, scheme up McVay. You're going to always have this team competitive, man. I'm liking what I'm seeing for the Rams and, for the Saints, man. And with the first pick, that's what it's looking like it's going to be for the New Orleans Saints, man, moving forward. Then we going to get into what most people across America was looking forward to in that 4 o'clock spot. Jim Nantz and Tony Romo, CBS style, had the Kansas City Chiefs taking on the Buffalo Bills. This game was played in Buffalo. It's the last year of their stadium, before they got going to the new digs across the street. Chiefs, a lot of people, had high expectations for the Chiefs. They've been playing some good football in the last 3 weeks of the year. And so, I thought that it was going to be tough sledding, though, going into Buffalo. From a standpoint of the Chiefs still haven't been able to establish a run game. I think Buffalo, even though they was a little timid on defense as far as the injuries is concerned, I thought overall as a defensive unit, they played, good, holding them with a donut in the first quarter and the third quarter. And if a good team like the Chiefs, you can hold them scoreless within half the game, you got a good shot of knocking them off. I think Josh Allen, just showed he was Josh Allen. Mistake-free football, kept it real basic. 273 yards passing, a touchdown, had a rushing touchdown. You know how he do. James Cook with a bill on the ground. Kincaid, 100 yards receiving and a touchdown for him. And, it's an impressive win. It's a lot of people say that, hey, man, Chiefs, had this team's number in the playoffs, but, the regular season has been more so Buffalo, and this game shouldn't be meaningless for Buffalo. Nah, I don't believe that. I think that at the end of the day, these records going to mean something. And the Chiefs sitting at 5-4, man, you just can't hit the go button, especially when you don't have an established run game. Now, Kareem Hunt, he's, does a decent job, but you got to have really, what I call a legitimate running game where you hand the ball off 20 to 25 times, man, and a guy can get you a bill or something out there. So For the Chiefs, we'll see if they're able to bounce back, man. For the Buffalo Bills, 6-2 on the year, man. Things looking upward for them. Then we had, the Sunday night football slate, man. Washington Commanders taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Seahawks travel to Washington. Sam Darnold was just amazing. I mean, amazing. 4 touchdowns in this football game. 330 yards. He had an interception, man, but it was meaningless at that point. Story of the game, from the Commanders side, man, is just really Jaden Daniels. He's injured again. Looks like his season may be over with the dislocated right elbow. And it's just been one of those years, man. The Commanders, the NFL is week to week, year to year. And so just because, he was outstanding, greatest rookie season ever and all, they got to the, NFC championship game and all that. This league, man, teams do film study on you. He already came into this league as a slight guy. I wish him the best, obviously, to get back on the football field as soon as he can. But, for the Commanders, it looks like this might be a lost season for them. For the Seahawks, man, 6-2. They 4-0 on the road out here, man. This is a team that traveled way from Seattle, way to the East Coast. Came up, put up a 38 spot on the Commanders, man. Got them out of that 38-14. So shout out to them. And so, yeah, that's my look across week number 9 across the National Football League. It was a lot of exciting, gameplay. When you came into the week, you really didn't kind of know what to expect. Obviously, we had that, heavyweight matchup between, the Chiefs and the Bills, in this week. But, overall, it was some good football. There was some teams that, was able to get some positive footing. For the teams, like the Detroits of the world and Green Bays of the world, it wasn't a good week for them. But we'll see if they're able to pick up the pieces, man, next week and see what it do, man. So, first and foremost, man, I appreciate all the love, appreciate all the feedback, and appreciate your ear. Coming up, we got the rest of the show. We on Fire Sports Podcast. That's Spots. Welcome back. And before we get out of here, man, we got our latest installment of my Big 5. This is my Big 5 NFL rankings, man, through week number 9 of the National Football League season. Man, this has been interesting. This thing has been interesting. There's been some teams that, we thought coming into the season was basically, kind of locks as far as maybe winning the division, maybe making a move this season. We got some teams that we've seen that young teams, still kind of on the cusp of maybe coming up a little bit. Maybe, the Jacksonvilles of the world and so forth. They big time win, but then a couple, disappointing losses. So this Big 5, actually, this is the most thought-provoking Big 5 I've had so far, because we really got a couple honorable mentions in the slate, but we going to keep it all the way 100, man, and stick within our 5. So coming in at number 5, man, I got the Denver Broncos coming in at 5, man. This team with Sean Payton, he's made a fool out of me. I thought when he first got there, I thought he was tweaking. Kicked, Russell Wilson out of there. Had some tough love out there, man. Just kind of criticized this whole situation. The Denver Broncos had a lot of money to eat with Russell Wilson with the contract and everything, but things are looking brighter. Drafted Bo Nix. Bo Nix, outstanding rookie campaign. Sophomore year, he's playing pretty much kind of at about the same level. This is a team that like running the football. J.K. Dobbins, Harvey, the youngin' over there. Just liking what they're able to do on the defensive side of the football. Got a lot of young talent over there. Liking what I'm seeing. Obviously Surtain being out, it's going to be a loss for the next couple of weeks for them. But I'm loving what I'm seeing from the Broncos, man. This team is gritty. They've won in every kind of way you can win so far this season. Coming back from the dead, fourth quarter type comebacks. So, all that type of magic, man, we've seen so far from the Denver Broncos, man. They had a toughie last week, traveling on the road to knock off the Houston Texans. And so, man, I got to, put some respect on their name. They 7-2 right now, man. I'm liking what I'm seeing. They in the driver's seat in that AFC West so far, man. So I got the Broncos coming in at number 5. At number 4, this is a team that, they sometimes they can be undersold a little bit, even though a lot of people who watch the National Football League like watching what they bring and what they put out there on display every single Sunday. They got, to me, one of the most dynamic or dynamic type of coaches out there. And Sean McVay, scheme up McVay and the LA Rams I got coming in at number 4. This is a team, got the weapons with, Devontae Adams going out there. He looking good. Puka Nacua. They probably got the best, wide receiver duo in the National Football League. A lot of people saying, talking heads, Dallas got the best. Nah, man. I think it might be out there in Los Angeles, just what the Rams able to do. Also running the football with Kyron Williams, Stafford playing some of the best football we probably seen from Mattman since they won, the Super Bowl a couple of years ago. So I'm liking what I'm seeing. McVay and his defense is, getting better week by week. So I'm liking what I'm seeing from the Rams, man. And, right now, just in that NFC West, they got a real shot at, winning that division and going where they need to go. Currently 6-2 on the season so far. So we'll see what it do, man. We'll see if the Rams are able to kind of scheme up and level up to what I consider that top tier in the NFC. They might already be there, man. So we'll see what it do, man, for the Rams. I got them coming in at number 4. At number 3, this is a team that if I probably would have had this Big 5 power rankings last week, they'd probably be at the top of the power rankings. But they took an ugly loss to the Pittsburgh Steelers this week, even though they still made the game close and competitive. Yeah, I'm talking about the Indianapolis Colts, man, at number 3. Danny Dimes, he came back to earth. The clock struck 12 for him this weekend. The Pittsburgh Steelers defense was stout, and they was looking because a lot of people called them old and just inept. But, they put them bootstraps, they tightened them up and got about it and had, Daniel Jones looking like a turnover machine this weekend. Held Jonathan Taylor to under 50 yards, rushing. So it could be simply a bad day at the office. I believe that. I'm not saying that I think that the Colts may be able to get out of the AFC, but I'm liking what I'm seeing from them so far. They got a balanced offense. They throwing the ball down the field. They hadn't really been turning the ball over until last week. Defense is playing and holding steady. So I'm liking what I'm seeing from the Colts, man. Shout out to Shane Steichen, head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. Been doing an outstanding job with this team. And I got them coming in at number 3. At number 2, this one was kind of interesting to me because this team actually had a bye last week. We really hadn't seen them. But they look good on offense the last time we seen them, man. The Philadelphia Eagles, man, defending world champions. I got them coming in at number 2. Now, for me, it's really with the Eagles, man. I side on just the experience and also, too, they got a little humble pie so far early part of the season for them. So I think that, for the Eagles, they've kind of learned. I think the bye week came at a real good time for the Philadelphia Eagles. Some of them guys can get healthy. A.J. Brown can get healthy. See if he'll suit up, with the Monday night tilt. I think they got a Monday night tilt coming up, this week as we'll preview, week, number 10, man, coming up later this week. But I'm liking what I'm seeing from the Eagles. The defense is playing a little better now. And so, like I said, that bye came in at the right point in time. I got them young Eagles coming in at number 2. At number 1, I got them young Buffalo Bills coming in at number 1. Now, they was a team that, about had this, Big 5 last week before. Nah, they wouldn't have been at the top. Here's why. I think that just like the Eagles, they got a little humble pie with them losses that they had. I think that at the end of the day, though, they knew they had to level up against the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm not saying the Kansas City Chiefs is the Chiefs as we all know, but the Buffalo Bills, this was a prove-it game. Hey, we need to get, this ship, on the right side. They was able to get that established. I still got a couple questions about the wide receivers. I heard the whole back and forth between Keon Coleman and Steve Smith. Not too long ago, just, getting into it just on that end, like them guys need to step up and help Josh Allen. Maybe we'll see that moving forward in the year. So, I got the Bills coming in at number 1, man, but this thing is tight, especially in that AFC. It's still kind of wide open a little bit. A lot of people think Baltimore be able to make a run and do what it do. There's a lot of other teams out there that's jockeying for position. Like I said, it could have been a bunch of what I consider kind of honorable mentions, on this list. Guys, teams like the Seattle Seahawks, team that right now 6-2, 4-0, on the road so far this season. Teams like the New England Patriots, 7-2 on the year, on a hot streak right now after knocking off the Atlanta Falcons. Can't forget about, obviously, the Green Bay Packers, even though they had an ugly loss against the Panthers. They in that fold. Detroit could be in that fold. Ugly loss last week against the Vikings. So, this thing is kind of, volatile a little bit. So, we'll see what it do, man. But first and foremost, I appreciate you guys checking out the episode. Again, episode number 15. We on 5 Sports Podcast, The Spot. And man, I appreciate you guys, man. I'll be right back at you towards the end of the week. Just preview week number 10 and what else is going on and cracking across the sporting landscape. First and foremost, man, I appreciate all the love and the feedback. I appreciate your ear. We on Fire Sports Podcast. The spots.